The first video in a long run of videos I'm about to make, we're going to start with B12 because the boring stuff is actually pretty important. And B12 is not just about whether or not you took a vitamin, it's about whether or not the vitamin made it through the entire supply chain. So this is going to get a little nerdy, I apologize in advance, but the supply chain is kind of where everything can break. So let's start with food. Most dietary B12 comes from animal foods, meat, fish, eggs, dairy. That's why vegans and strict vegetarians have to pay closer attention to this specific vitamin. It's not because plants are morally failing them, it's just because B12 is not showing up in meaningful amounts in most of their foods. But eating B12 is only the first step. So your stomach still has to release it from the protein it's attached to in the food, and that requires stomach acid and digestive enzymes. And then the B12 binds to carrier proteins, and then it has to bind to intrinsic factor, which is made by cells in the stomach. Then that B12 and the intrinsic factor complex has to make it all the way to your small intestine, which is actually where everything gets absorbed. So nothing actually happens in your stomach, contrary to popular belief. And that's a lot of steps just for something people would casually explain as, just eat more of the right foods. But food matters. But absorption matters more. And with B12 absorption, it's not really a side note, it's the whole book. So that's why people can eat a ton of animal foods and still have this vitamin issue. And low stomach acid can be part of the problem. Medications can be a problem. If you have a gut disease, it can be a problem. Having a gastric bypass causes a problem. Your age. Pernicious anemia, which is an autoimmune, where the body interferes with the stomach cells or intrinsic factor needed to absorb B12 properly. So yes, someone can eat meat, take their vitamins, and think their diet is fine, but still not absorb any of it. So it's not that they're unmotivated to get B12. It's literally a supply chain issue. And so that's the reason why injections exist. And that's why ultimately that's what we offer. So a B12 injection bypasses the gut. It strips all of the stomach acid, intrinsic factors, small intestine, that whole obstacle course. But it also doesn't mean that oral B12 never works. So high dose stuff can work in some people, but if absorption is the concern, injections are direct and consistent. So you're not asking the digestive system for help. And so once B12 is in the body, it still has to do actual work. And that's usually where, when people talk about it, they get shallow. So people will say B12 gives you energy, and then they kind of don't talk anymore. And that's kind of like saying the car needs gas and forgetting that it actually needs an engine, a transmission, a battery, and someone to drive it. So B12 has two major active jobs in the body, and one of them is tied to methylcobalamin. The other one is tied to adenosylcobalamin. I always mess that one up. So methylcobalamin works in the methylation side, and that includes homocysteine, methionine production, DNA production, red blood cell formation. And that's part of why a deficiency can show up as anemia. Cells that divide quickly, like red blood cell precursors, they need the DNA process to work correctly. So if it doesn't, you can get larger, immature red blood cells and not any of the oxygen that the smaller blood cells would actually provide. And that's one reason why low B12 can feel like fatigue. But fatigue is an easy symptom, and it can be attached to anything. But so B12 is involved in myelin maintenance, and myelin sheathing is the insulation around your nerves. And when myelin is not properly maintained, nerve signaling can get screwed up. That can be why your hands get, numb or feel like they're burning. Weakness, like literally balance issues, it can make you walk different, your memory stops working, your mood's different, brain fog. And a person's not going to connect any of that to vitamins, because vitamins get marketed by, like cute little chewable things. But a B12 deficiency can be neurological, and neurological stuff is not cute. And that's where autoimmune conversations kind of come in. So things like MS, autoimmune neuropathies, they already involve the nervous system, and B12 is not going to cure them or fix it. So we're not replacing neurology. You're still going to need imaging. You're still going to need your medications. But low B12 can create symptoms that will overlap with those neurological diseases, and it makes it harder to read the whole picture. So if someone already has an autoimmune that's neuro and they're low in B12, those two things are hitting the same general system. The autoimmune disease might be one thing, and then a B12 deficiency could be the other issue. And because both of them involve nerves, the myelin sheathing, weakness, sensory changes, fatigue, cognitive symptoms, ignoring B12 is like a bad way to troubleshoot. It's not that B12 will fix MS. It's that B12 treats some of the same symptoms that are in some of these autoimmunes. And because the deficiency can mimic them, you need to rule out like this deficiency, or you need to correct it if it's low to rule it out. Because B12 deficiency is one of the neurological problems where if you miss it, there's long-term consequences. And some nerve issues improve if B12 is corrected. But the timing matters, and it can get harder the longer you let it go. So the next step is talking about the forms. So there are 4 types of B12. This blows people's minds. You have cyanocobalamin, hydroxycobalamin, methylcobalamin, and adenylcobalamin. Methyl and adenylyl are the 2 active forms. Cyano and hydroxo they can still help, but they have to be converted. It doesn't make them useless. It just means that you're starting at a different point. So cyanocobalamin is popular because it's very cheap and very stable. That's why it's in all kinds of pills. It's in cheap shots. And yes, cyanocobalamin has a cyanide molecule attached to it. That does not mean B12 is poisoning you. Do not listen to Gary Brecka. This is one thing I hear online that gets butchered all the time. But there is a criticism of it. Cyanocobalamin is not an active form, and it has to be processed and converted before it can be used, whereas methyl and adenylyl do not. Hydroxycobalamin has to be converted as well, but it has other medical uses that can be useful in certain settings. Like if you have cyanide poisoning, they will give you hydroxycobalamin to bind the cyanide to get rid of it. So methylcobalamin is already one of the active forms, and that's the reason why we choose it, especially when we're talking about the methylation and nervous system side of B12. It gives the body a form that is already active for one of the major pathways instead of starting with something that has to be converted first. And this is also where storage and retention become part of the topic. So B12 is absolutely water soluble. And yes, the body can store B12, and it mostly gets stored in the liver. But that doesn't mean every single form behaves the same once it uptakes into your body. The body has to transport B12, process it, convert it, use it, and then store what's left. And a form that has to be converted first is not the same as one that's an active form directly. So if a cyanocobalamin molecule has to have the cyanide stripped, the cobalamin molecule has to go through the methylation process using folate to make it active for use and to make it work on the cells. The problem is the body cannot store that molecule because it wasn't active to begin with. And this is the part that everybody oversimplifies. When they think water soluble, they think it doesn't matter because you can just pee it out. And they think B12 and they think all the forms are the same. And neither of those is a smart way to explain it. The form matters, the absorption matters, and the conversion matters. So then you get into tissue handling, the patient specifically, and that's where the B12 conversation actually should be. That's why it's not reduced to just an energy shot. Energy may be something that people notice because it's cognitive, but the real story is much bigger than that, as we've explained. B12 is involved in red blood cell formation, DNA production, methylation, the myelin maintenance we talked about, and any normal nerve function. So deficiency could look physical, mental, neurological, and sometimes weird enough that people will chase 10 other explanations before they check B12. So when someone asks why we use methylcobalamin, it's not because the other forms are fake. It's because methylcobalamin is already an active form. It fits the nervous system and methylation conversion, and it avoids without having to start with cyanocobalamin or hydroxycobalamin that needs to be converted. It avoids acting like every form has its same handling, the same storage, and even the same retention. And it keeps the explanation closer to what the body is actually trying to do with B12 in the first place. So B12 is not just a vitamin that people should take because they're tired. It's a nutrient with a complicated supply chain and some really, really important jobs. And if the supply chain breaks, the symptoms can get really messy and really uncomfortable. If the nervous system is involved, the stakes are even higher. And if somebody already has a neurological or autoimmune issue, the B12 status shouldn't be ignored just because it's not a flashy talking point, or it's not as cool as whatever peptide is trending this week. So B12 does matter, but it's not a hype thing. As basic biology that becomes a real problem when the body cannot get enough of it, absorb it, convert it, or use it correctly. And people also talk about frequency when it comes to B12, right? Oh, we need to do this every other day, every third day. When you're using something like methylcobalamin, that's not true either. We have patients that have pernicious anemia that see us every 6 weeks on maintenance for a 5 milligram shot of methylcobalamin, and their labs are perfect. It doesn't have to cost a ton of money. You don't have to do it all the time. And it's not as crazy, unabsorbable or unstorable as everyone likes to make it out to be, just because B12 is water soluble.